Hi, in this lecture we're going to talk about the genre of historical fiction, which is related to realistic fiction because both of these genres are really focused on the creation of stories that seem very realistic. However, the main difference is that historical fiction, unlike contemporary realistic fiction, is set at some point in the past. And as I mentioned in my lecture on realistic fiction, what is contemporary versus what is historical is really up for debate depending on who you ask. I just tend to make 25 years like my rule of thumb for determining whether a book is set in contemporary times or historical times, but that number is totally arbitrary. However, events that clearly took place a long time ago, before most of us were born, like World War II, World War I, the American Revolution, those are clearly books that would be considered to be historical fiction if the books are set during those time periods. And sometimes historical fiction will include actual historical events as well as real historical figures in them. For example, one of my favorite works of historical fiction is Al Capone Does My Shirts by Jennifer Choldenko. And that book has Al Capone as a very minor character in the book, although he takes a more prominent role in the two series to that book, or sorry, to the two sequels. That's what I meant, to the two sequels of Al Capone Does My Shirts. So historical fiction is important for several reasons. It can make history seem more important and more interesting and much more alive to young readers than just simply reading about history in a textbook. And historical fiction can provide students with background knowledge about historical events that they can then apply when they go to study about a historical period in social studies. And what's really great about historical fiction is it helps show different perspectives about what life was like in the past, and textbooks really don't do that. For example, there are many, many children's books that were set during the period of time in World War II, and from reading those books, I just have learned so many different aspects to World War II that I wasn't aware of before I read the books. Like, for example, I wasn't aware that children were often evacuated out of major cities to go live in the countryside so they could be safe and not have to worry about being bombed. Something I didn't know about at all until I read a children's book about it, and in fact that information is true. So as I mentioned before, reading historical fiction can really help students build their prior knowledge about history, and can make history really seem like it's more alive and more and children really can create more of a connection to it than they could otherwise. And oftentimes historical fiction can be paired with nonfiction in order to help readers make those connections between fact and fiction. For example, if I was teaching about life in colonial America, one of the big threats that the colonists faced was not just living in a fledgling nation, but also the fact that they didn't have immunity or ways to treat diseases like yellow fever. In the book Fever 1793 by Laurie Anderson, she writes about a girl named Maddie who's living in Philadelphia in 1793, and all of the people around Maddie are falling down with yellow fever, and Maddie has to cope with it herself. I might pair a book like that with An American Plague by Jim Murphy, which is a nonfiction book that I've talked about in another lecture, all about the true story of the yellow fever epidemic that hit Philadelphia in 1793. So if you're reading Maddie's story, you can begin to understand that human aspect of what it would have been like to live in Philadelphia during that time when yellow fever was raging and people were getting sick left and right, and many, many people died. But Jim Murphy's story gives you the facts about that and who are the major historical figures that were involved in that true historical event. So when you evaluate historical fiction for use in your classroom or your library, you need to worry about the authenticity as well as the accuracy. Now, of course, historical fiction is made up from the author's imagination, but they should be getting the historical details correct in their story. We should be looking for historical details, but we don't want to be bogged down by so many details about like what life was like in the past that we're so bored by the story. We also want to make sure that the norms and values that were typical of the time period are reflected in the book. For example, in the evolution of Calpurnia Tate, the protagonist of the story, Calpurnia, is really interested in becoming a scientist, and she's always helping her grandfather go out in the woods and around the creek and, looking at the flora and fauna, so to speak. And that is really unusual for that time period. In 1899, Texas girls were expected to be very prim and proper, and they weren't really supposed to be going out with their grandfathers looking at, plants and bugs and things like that. So Calpurnia is really unusual. But the attitude towards girls who behave that way is reflected in the book, because Calpurnia's mother is always like, you need to learn how to be a lady, you need to start learning how to manage a household, and so forth. So we really see that those attitudes and norms that were typical of the time are reflected in the book, even though Calpurnia marches to the beat of her own drummer, and she's very much unlike other girls during her time period. Language is also an issue with historical fiction. If a book is set very far into the past, the language that people would have spoken during that time period would be very archaic and probably challenging to read for modern readers. So when we're looking at language in works of historical fiction, I think it's okay for authors to use modern versions of English, but what we don't want to see are like slang terms. Like if we're reading a book set in the 1800s and a character is saying LOL, that's clearly, a 20th century term that we don't want to see in a book set in the 1800s. So be careful about that when you're selecting historical fiction. And when authors are describing actual historical events or historical figures, we want to make sure that they are not distorting those figures and that they are getting the information about those events or those people correct in their books. So good historical fiction will often be accompanied by an author's note indicating the research that the author has done about the time period. If you're reading a work of historical fiction and the author doesn't explain how he or she learned about that historical period, then you should be skeptical about the accuracy of the book, because then we have to assume the author could have just taken liberties with facts and made things up. One of the great things about historical fiction is that we can actually learn like true facts about what life was like in another time period. So historical fiction should also be interesting and relevant to the reader of today. Oftentimes, really great historical fiction is going to be told through the eyes of a child protagonist, much like the readers. And that allows readers to really connect with the past, because they're reading about a young person like themselves who just happened to live decades or even centuries before. And we also want quality historical fiction for young people to not sugarcoat the mistakes and the terrible things that happened in history. For example, in one work of historical fiction that was published in the last couple years, Stella by Starlight by Sharon Draper, the protagonist of the story is African American, and she's living in a small town in the South. And the KKK is becoming very active in her town, and she sees one of their rallies one night when she goes out to get some fresh air. And in the book doesn't describe the KKK as horrifically as it actually was, but in the story at one point the KKK does burn down a home belonging to one of Stella's neighbors, and the community has to cope with that. So the author does address like the horrible things that the Klan did during that period of time, even though it certainly doesn't address all of the horrible things the Klan has done throughout the years. It doesn't gloss over the reality that they destroyed property and they intimidated people and did other very terrible things. So one way that you can find quality historical fiction is by turning to the Scott Odell Award. And this was established in the early 1980s by Scott Odell, who is a well-known children's author. You might be familiar with his books like Island of the Blue Dolphins and Julie of the Wolves, and he's written many, many more. And he was a really strong advocate of the historical fiction genre, which is why he established an award using his own name. And this is an award given to outstanding works of historical fiction. And if you visit the website, the link is provided here, you can certainly find other great examples of historical fiction. And of course, works of historical fiction tend to be popular with the Newbery Committee. If you look at Newbery Medal and Honor winners throughout the years, many, many of those books are works of historical fiction. So that's another way you can identify some great historical fiction. So I'm going to stop this lecture here, and in the next lecture, I'm going to talk you through some historical fiction titles that I've enjoyed.